What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you ideological goodness. That's right, podcasts, dropping it right into your earbuds so you can think, reflect, and brew your own faith. And today on the podcast, we have a special episode. We have a return. Make 1,600 episodes ago, there are these two individuals that joined the podcast, Doug Pagitt and Tony Jones, and they are back. They are back, and we are going to have an amazing conversation. One that really is grounded on the fact we've been friends a whole long time. And here's why. Doug Pagitt was part of the emerging church movement, integral in organizing and launching it, and as part of that whole movement, his home church that he planted, Solomon's Porch, played an integral role. It's also the church Tony ended up going to and was a part of for quite a while. And just a few weeks ago, it had its last worship service. And I thought, that is a conversation worth having. What has he learned? What has he gained? What were the struggles? What was the process of the whole story connected to Solomon's Porch, the emerging church movement? And we unpack it here. And I'll just say, it's quite a joy to have two different friends thinking, reflecting, wrestling out loud about this. It was a blast. And if you dig this, if you dig it, then you definitely want to check out the brand new podcast, Homebrewed Christianity, is launching in 2024. That's right. It's called Emerged. It's an oral history of the emerging church movement. And we've been putting quite a bit of work on it. Tony Jones and I have been working with our producer, Josh Gilbert. We have done 20 plus interviews with leaders. We have collected oral stories and testimonies from a host of other people. And we already have over 1,000 people that are in the community sharing their memories, their pictures, and all, just like to bring together this professionally produced podcast, Emerged. I'm totally excited about it. We would love for you to check it out. If you go to emergepodcast.com, you can sign up, and guess what? You can donate anything you want to the production. You don't have to donate, but here's what happens if you're a part of the Emerge Podcast Insider Group. There's the whole getting all of the episodes, right? Because we're going to have the professionally produced episodes coming out every other week in 2024. But then the off weeks, we're going to have a live stream where a host of our different friends from the emerging church movement join us. You're going to get unedited interviews that we did with so many of these people like Nadia Boltz-Weber, Rachel Held Evans, Brian McLaren, Diana Butler Bass, Chris. Look, I'm not going to ruin it. I'm not going to tell it to you all now, but go to Emerge Podcast and you can be a part of it. And here's the other thing. Thank you for over 15 years of supporting Homebrewed Christianity. And I'm so excited to launch this new podcast with two of my friends, Josh and Tony, where we've gotten to interview tons of our other friends. It's going to be a walk down memory lane for some of us, and for others, it'll be an exploration of a movement that changed the shape of American religion. So go check it out. And you know what? If you dig it, support it. It's kind of like the Homebrewed community. You know, those people that donate every month for Homebrewed Christianity, get the secret members podcast feed and all these other kinds of things, except the Emerge podcast is going to be weaving together multiple interviews, telling a cohesive story and all that kind of stuff. emergepodcast.com if you want to join it. If you want to end up seeing me over the next year, I'm going to be doing a series of events with our friend Thomas J. Ord called God After Deconstruction. Head over to godafterdeconstruction.com if you want to check that out, including a class together, and we got a book by the same name. All that is going down. Go to godafterdeconstruction.com. And you know what else happens in 2024? We announce the dates and location for next year's Theology Beer Camp. If you want to be on the inside scoop, go to theologybeer.camp. Just give us your email. We'll send you an email with all the details as they come out. That way you get access to the early ticket. Save yourself some money. Make sure you get a ticket before it sells out, because this year is going to be even more zesty. All righty? Well, here we go, friends. I appreciate you listening. Enjoy the conversation. Me and Tony are joined by our friend, Doug Pagitt. And guess what? When the podcast launches January 1st, that first week, I'm going to be in Minneapolis, and we are going to do the members only live stream from Doug's house. All right. So Josh and Tony and I, all three of us going to be together at Doug's house, and some other local emerging church community peeps will be in the house. There's a high chance that even our dear friend Mason Miniga will be there. Anyway, go check it out. emergepodcast.com. Peace. All right. Hello, friends. This is Trip, and returning to the podcast as a duo is Doug Pagitt and Tony Jones. Now, y'all have both been on the podcast a number of times, but I believe it's been 1,587 episodes, and since you were on the Homebrewed Christianity podcast together, and this time you're not in character.
Doug, do you know we did an entire episode in character?
Right now, that's coming back to me in vivid detail. Yes, I do. I do recall that. And I would do it again in a minute if you're up for it, Tony. I would kick in Big Brother Duke Arnold on the drop of a dime.
Oh, well,
And now you can play guitar, so you can join in on the
100%.
Church Basement Roadshow song.
Yeah. Mark would not take my guitar away from me the way he did another person. Hey, Trip, I feel like I was on one of the earliest episodes of Homebrewed Christianity with you and Bo. Do you remember at all any of that? Would have been the first year, first week, first episode?
The podcast was we did 4 years before Bo was a part of the podcast with Chad. Was the original person.
R.I.P.
Yes.
Maybe it's with Chad.
What?
You were probably on at some point with Trip and Chad, Doug.
Oh, you've been on you've been on a multiplicity of times. But yeah. It
15 years ago, would that be right? Is that possible? Okay.
Yeah. We're almost 16 years old. And
yeah.
Congratulations. Perseverance. Quantity over quality. That's how I do it. That's how I do it.
Yep.
But this one's gonna be fun. So for people listening, that in the very near future, the beginning of the year, we're launching the Emerged podcast, which you should just go subscribe to and things, because they're not going to show up in this feed all the time. And then you'll say to yourself, well, what was that thing Trip and Tony were talking to Doug about? And they mentioned this podcast or history of the emerging church. Well, go to emergepodcast.com and you'll be able to, you'll see what happens when I actually, we pay a real editor to edit out Trip's asides and stories. And when he asks 3 questions in hopes he'll answer one of them, that'll be there along with the story of the emerging church movement. But kind of like luring you to check that out, and the fun of getting to ask Tony and Doug questions together, and thinking about a lot of the transitions have happened, including Solomon's Porch, the church you were both a part of. Doug was the minister and such, like it ending. Like I thought, this is quality material to tell people about the podcast and hear someone reflect on that whole journey, being a part of both the movement and then the local expression. And one of the things that kind of shows up repeatedly in the interviews we did for the oral history is the role of friendship. And you two are longtime friends. I want to hear the origin story of you meeting Tony, and how many times did you have to hang out with him before you chose to, right? Like that you knew, I want to be his friend, be on stage with him, run events. It just takes a certain kind of person, to really partner with Tony. And I'm wondering, as an expert, what that story's like.
I mean, I have very vivid memory. I started working at my home church in January of 1997 as the youth and young adults minister. We didn't use the term pastor back then. And a veteran youth pastor from down the road, another big church just down the highway, that'd be Doug, invited me out to lunch at what was then called the Pantry. It's now called Hilltop.
I was just there a week ago.
Oh, yeah. And he said, I like to welcome every new youth worker in town. And he was real connected in with youth specialties and the National Network of Youth Ministers and stuff like that. And so we had this great lunch. I thought we really connected. And then I reached out to him, I think like a month later, because one of the things I inherited at that church was over President's Weekend, we had an all-night broomball tournament where we rented the big hockey arena in our town, which has 2 indoor ice sheets, and we ran a tournament. And like every church in town came to this, except for Grace Church, because they only would come if they could give a testimony at some point during the night, including they wanted Chris Carter, the wide receiver from the Vikings, to come and give his testimony, which I said no to him on that. Anyway, so I reached out to Doug. I called over to the church because this is like pre-email in 1997. And they said, oh, yeah, he doesn't work here anymore. He moved to Texas. I don't know if I got the timing exactly right. I don't know when you moved to Texas, but don't let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Still true. Right. Didn't happen like that, and it's absolutely true. Gary, Tony, I remember being in the locker room at a local health club. And Gary Giltner. We
called him Lurch. Lurch.
Yes. We're both tall fellas. He's 25 years older than me, I think. And I would see him regularly in there, and we would locker next to each other, and I'd be like, I'm going to end up looking like that guy, I think, someday. And I remember him saying to me, hey, we got a new youth pastor, really great at our church, and you should meet him. And so I remember, I don't know, leaving there maybe that morning and sending over a message. And I bring that up, Trip, because I liked Gary. Gary knew Tony, and Gary said, you should meet Tony. And I'll just say, like, that's generally how life kind of happens, right? Had Gary not said something, maybe I wouldn't have been tuned in to Tony being new. And I was in the process of getting ready to take a job to go work in Texas, a group called Leadership Network, which ultimately became one of the organizations that helped to organize a lot of this work. But truly, had I not talked to Gary that morning and met Tony, it may have been like, oh, I'm kind of phasing out now. Maybe I won't do that thing of reaching out to local youth pastors or something. So the serendipity of that moment's not lost on me. But I will say, Tony, like you had recounted, it was minutes into that lunch when I was like, oh no, this is somebody I want to do stuff with. Yeah, I mean, it was nearly instantaneous, that, as far as I remember, at least.
And then Doug was super generous in inviting me that August to a meeting in Dallas to plan, or would that have been 98 when the Glorietta event happened? Was that 98? I think 98. So I think in 97, you invited me to some youth ministry thing at Mount Hermon camp, and nobody showed up. But it was like you, me, Mark Ostreicher, and Tick Long. And remember, we went to Palm Springs for the day and like got massages and smoked cigars.
Like, I don't know, what are we gonna do? Let's not stay here. Let's drive to Palm Springs.
Because like no other youth pastor showed up for this little Leadership Network confab
thing. Yeah, that was weird.
And here's a memory of that. So I remember thinking like, well, this is my shot. I got Tick Long and Mark Ostreicher. Tick was the president of YS maybe at the time, and Marco was the publisher. And I ended up getting in a truck, Tick's pickup truck, because that was the
pickup truck. In fact,
that we called it what?
A tick-up truck.
Because that was the vehicle where cigars were allowed.
Yeah.
And I was smoking a cigar. So I get in there, and I remember leaning forward between their two they were in the front seats. And I remember leaning forward and pitching them the idea for a book, Postmodern Youth Ministry. And they were not interested in it. It was received very coolly. But then, I don't know, maybe a few months later, I get a call from Mark Ostreicher who says, hey, we think group publishing is going to put out a book on postmodern youth ministry. How fast can you write? That was like literally what he asked me. How fast can you write? I'm like, well, pretty fast.
And that's emblematic of a lot of the things that went on in our world. The upside is it was very relational and friendship oriented. The downside was, because that was kind of an operating motif that was intentional, but also just sort of happened. That meant there were a lot of people who weren't in those social networks and spaces that we didn't always have access to. And so much of what we were having to do over all the years of the emerging church stuff was done in such a period of psychological abundance, but actual scarcity. We didn't have other ways to meet people short of who should we know, and is there somebody nearby that we could maybe get to come to something? And it was all functioning, Trip, in that weird little kind of social networks before the things that we now have that can support that kind of thing. We're using a lot of analog. How do you meet people and catch up? And I'll just say that became both an asset and a struggle point for the effort overall was that personal connection, relational side. We didn't have a lot of intentionality to break out of it. I don't know if we knew that we didn't, but we didn't. And and I don't know if we even had the access to those tools to even think about that. I mean, we thought we were doing that. We thought we were reaching as broadly and as far as we could, and we did. I mean, there was we were conscious of a lot of things, but we didn't know all the people we didn't know. That we could now. Like now I feel like every day I'm like, man, so many people out there are doing so many things and I have no access to them, or I don't know them at all, but there's more people than I know. And I used to feel like, I don't know if we can find anybody doing anything. Like, you hear rumors of people and rumors about rumors of people.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that that might be helpful for kind of setting up what you talked about, moving to Texas, working with the Leadership Network, which kind of sets up eventually, what people know as Emergent Village, but at some point, that kicks off, and then you're back in Minneapolis and church planting Solomon's Porch. As someone who, both in their books and when you give talks and in your framing, so often anthropology has been your starting point, both like academically and college and such, but the way you started thinking about the change in cultures, the change in community, the change in religion, change in technology, in that kind of move, and then going back to Minneapolis to church plant and kind of coordinate this growing network of friends. Like, what were the strategic decisions where you thought, okay, I'm thinking about this and I'm doing this, and which were the ones that you're like, well, I got 5 options here. Let's see who says yes or gives permission or doesn't try to ruin it.
It was more about a commitment to practitioner-based experimentation. That was something I valued quite intensely from my own spiritual experiences of how I got into Christianity and the church that I'd worked in and the college. I went to a Christian college that I was in. So I was very interested in people who were doing things while they were trying to extend what they were doing, like a practitioner-based, deep, reflective experimentation. Those words were all over all of the stuff we were talking about all the time. And the context for that was the sociocultural context was thinking about the impact on cultural change as it impacts Gen X people who are not entering churches at the same rate as the fiction of the previous generations, right? And so I mockingly refer to that as the fiction. So I was never really into generationalism because I thought it was a bad form of sociology and anthropology, and still to this day. In fact, earlier today I was babbling on about how I think it's such nonsense. But we were deeply concerned about our own lived experience as Gen X-y people and trying to say, we need to do something that responds to the needs that we knew. So both Tony and I were like older end of Gen Xers, and we're fairly young as youth pastors. In the space between being a youth pastor and the people that were in the youth ministry, volunteers or teenagers or college people, it was all one kind of age vibe. And interestingly, Solomon's Porch, kind of the church then that I ended up starting, that came out of all of this stuff, started in 2000, was also kind of age centric around that same group of people, right? It was, that it was those people in their 20s and their 30s and their 40s that we, until this day. So it was kind of experimentation inside of an age demographic, because that was our lived experience. Like over and over, we would say things about like, we're not trying to reach someone else. We're trying to figure out our own spirituality and the spirituality of these people that we know and understand in a local situation that felt, like what you should do to make that work. So that was kind of the approach. Like those were the struggles, not where could I get a job? My wife still asks me regularly, like, do you think it's probably time to get a job? Like, well, I'm getting a little late. I think I missed that window. I dodged that one long enough. And so it was never driven by that. It was this other prevailing, nagging question of could Christian spirituality be something of an asset and a benefit to us and those around us in the context that we find ourselves in? And that was kind of what Emergent Village was about, like just realizing that there were pastor people who needed connection, just like there were individuals that were living in a town somewhere and needed a community to be part of. Like it was the concentric circles of relational dynamics that we were thinking a lot about.
So when you were kind of facilitating a lot of networking with younger ministers and such, like what were the questions that most animated each other? Because if we went through some of the ideas, right, that ended up getting discussed at cohorts, or the problems that came up, or I'm going to scare quotes deconstruct X, Y, and Z. A lot of the topics are similar, but there's something different, I think, about the Gen X or the Leadership Network going into Emergent Village. The way those questions were framed, what the kind of creative, generative responses were different. Because think of how many of your friends and peers planted churches.
I want to point something out about that and hear Doug's response, because I think it's so interesting being, I know your audience includes a lot of, millennials who probably really identify with the deconstruction movement, the ex-evangelical movement. Of course, those were not really, we used the term deconstruction a little bit, but it was because we were all reading Jacques Derrida, and Jack Caputo was like one of our guys who came to our events and stuff. But I think one of the most fascinating things, because now people will say, the millennials deconstructing, it's just like the Gen Xers did with Emergent. But here's the thing. I mean, I didn't do it, and I'll tell you a story about why I didn't do it. But it was all about church planting. And I don't see nobody in the deconstructionist millennial movement is like, we need to go start fresh expressions and communities of faith where we can all get together. It's like, we're going to sit around in Facebook groups and lick our wounds about how much the church sucks and we're traumatized by it, all of which is totally legitimate. But that's simply not what we were doing. Maybe it's because we were mainly white, relatively affluent, mostly evangelical dudes who hadn't been traumatized by the church, just thought it could be done better. And then let me tell you, while I'm on the rant, about why I didn't plant a church. And I know exactly the moment. Doug and I were at a meeting with a bunch of other people that became kind of a famous meeting. We'll talk about it in the Emerged podcast. It took place in San Antonio, Texas, in the autumn of 1999. And Doug had left Leadership Network and moved back to Minnesota, and he and Shelley and a few other couples had started Solomon's Porch in, what did you call those, Doug? It hadn't officially launched yet. Did you call them pre-meetings, or? Mm-hmm. And you had your Y2K joke, so I'll let you tell it in case.
That's good, thank you.
Why you didn't start till
it's been a 23 year long running joke that I want to keep owning that thing. Yeah, I know. Somewhere we had some kind of like gathering, once a month get-togethers of some kind that we didn't call pre-launch, but they were like that. Like we were going to start and we just needed to be like doing things once a month in the fall. I think it was September, October, November. We did 3 of them, and then we started officially in January of 2020.
Because
oh yeah, we started on January 2nd because it was the first Sunday after the new millennium, and we thought, okay, this was still Y2K fear, like had the Red Hatters been around during that period of time, the conspiracies they really missed out. My thought was, well, if the world comes to a crashing end, that's a great time to start a church. And if the world doesn't come to a crashing end, it's also a great time to start a church. And I'm just enough of a contrarian and pain in the ass to be like, everybody starts churches on Easter. I live in Minnesota. This is where Tony and I both lived at the time. Well, Tony, I don't know if you were still here in Minnesota at the time.
Yeah.
Like January in Minnesota is, uninhabitable for people if you don't have a level of protection. Your safety's at risk. So I thought a perfect time to start a church is on the Sunday just after a cataclysm in a frozen tundra. Like those are the conditions that breed success.
So Doug's putting this together, I'm still a youth and young adult pastor at this other church, and I was there till 2003. So I was kind of marginally involved in Solomon's Porch. Like I go to a gathering once in a while and things like that. Maybe cover for Doug as a preacher or whatever. But we're at this meeting in San Antonio, and Doug's cell phone rings. Now, look, not many people had cell phones in 1999. Doug did. Doug's always been an early adopter. Probably a flip phone. Doug answers his phone. I remember where we were sitting at this Catholic retreat center, outdoors. He's, this is on like Saturday afternoon or something. Yeah, okay. All right. Okay, thanks. And I go, oh, what was that about? And he's sitting there kind of like scratching his chin, thinking. He goes, yeah, that was just a guy who's part of our core church planting team. And he and his wife, they're bowing out. They're not going to be part of Solomon's Porch. I'm like, oh, that sucks. And he goes, well, the problem is it's his PA system, and he's currently at the space taking the PA system out. And we have a gathering tomorrow night, like a pre-gathering. So then he's like, there's this audiovisual place in town. This is how well I remember this. He's like, I wonder if Tierney Brothers is still open and I could rent PA gear for tomorrow, because there's already a band put together. Yeah. And it was at that moment, Trip, that I'm like, I can never be a church planter. Because here I am as a youth pastor, I'm like, can't sleep at night if a kid changes from our youth group to another youth group, or parents are mad at me and leave the church and go to Christ Presbyterian instead of Colonial Church. Like, I can't sleep. And here Doug's just like, let's see, I got a problem to solve. And let me put that in a broader context then. All of the people that we talk about in the Emerged podcast, and all the people we were hanging out at that time with, and Doug, I'd love to hear your reflection on this. Karen Ward, Tim Keel, Chris C., Mike Stavland, frankly, although he was only briefly a part of it, Mark Driscoll, like people who are planting churches. It is such a courageous act to do it, because there is so much failure, I think, is just staring you in the face. It's one thing, frankly, and I'm not doing this to disparage millennial deconstructors, but it's one thing to start an Instagram account where you record videos about how much the church has hurt you. It's another thing to put your entire life on the line and like start a community of faith on your credit card. Mm-hmm. So Doug, I mean, I think I was like kind of a hanger-on in a lot of ways, and like the youth ministry guy in that group. But I look back now and think the courage of these people are like 28 and 30 years old starting communities.
Right, with families and no paycheck on the horizon, some of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just reminds me of the series of bad financial decisions I've made over the last 3 decades. And you know, one of the things that happens when you do something like this, and that other people consider to be brave or heroic, often in the moment, it doesn't feel that way. It's not a self-narrative of I'm being brave. It's normally a sense of like, I don't have another choice, right? And I was serious enough about my Christian spirituality and my vocation to say, I can't, there's not a future for me that I see as preferable inside this world. And I should say, Trip, I was working before going to Leadership Network in 1987 at a really big, very successful, nationally known church running a really big youth ministry. It was great, right? And then I went to work for a privately funded foundation where my job, Leadership Network, where my job was to find the next generation of significant church leaders on par with the church growth movement people, and funded by a person who was committed to giving all of his money away before his death for this kind of thing, and kind of as much money as I needed to spend on things to make it happen and make it work. And so it's not like I didn't have success or another option in that way. Like, I don't know, what job would I get? It was an internal narrative of there's something else that I want. There's a world that I want to see happen. And a lot of the people around that life then, a lot of the church planters had that view. It wasn't, our church experience wasn't enough or wasn't good, but the motivation was to make something. It was maker culture, kind of very deeply, kind of that, I don't know if people know this, early 2000s, late 1990s kind of cultural creatives. We talked a lot about that cultural movement and force, and people that were in very maker culture and entrepreneurial sort of, but more so like generative making. And that was the back narrative that we were that we were all into. So the response to problem was to make something, make theology, make music, make community. Like you said, to make all of it, right? Like we thought, I don't know, let's just, and then make a network of people to be involved in, and then come up with a funding stream for all, like just make it. And that maker's culture was probably, that's the thing that I'm guessing exists in the new deconstruction narrative some way that I don't see as much, and I don't know what it looks like, or because it's not that evident to me, but I'm assuming it's happening. But that was part and parcel to the emerging movement at the time, was make something. And there was a lot of pressure then put on people who wanted to talk about things. And I'll tell you, we talked about a lot of things. Like we had a lot of theological conversations and conferences and wrote books. And there was no jot nor tittle nor number of angels on the head of a pin that we were not willing to talk about till 3 a.m. in service of being useful to people in their actual lived lives, on this planet. At least that's how I felt about it. I always felt like it was, so the practitioner bias was toward usefulness.
In one of the, this is true, I think, for lots of church planters, where one example from just an interview I've recorded recently, where the person, I just said, oh, well, why'd you plant the church? They tell a specific story about 3 different people, and was like, they obviously needed the deep affirmation that I, as a Christian, think's at the heart of the gospel. They need community. They have questions they probably wouldn't be allowed. And if they showed up on Sunday, I'd stick them in a room full of other people that are at their same age, and make sure that their kids are with people that are background check, and hope Jesus shows up. And then you think about who's at your church and who these people are in their life, and go, no, we don't really want them there. This, like their lives, their struggles, their questions are things that don't matter. And this church player's like, well, that's why I just had to start a church.
Yeah.
And all those questions, all the struggle, all the life stuff that doesn't fit in the faith, they're very similar to the kinds of things we say now. But that kind of response, that starter, creator impulse is, well, the invitation of God and Christ is matters to these people's lives and their existence. And so if the church doesn't have space for them, then, well, I guess it's my job to go make one of those spaces. And I think that that kind of if that's your natural response, then that element of courage, or I got to go find a PA system this week, and all those kind of things kind of fit in this deep sense of calling to create, to make, and host and such.
It's kind of what you expect, right? When you're in that world. And that was the upside to the evangelical background that I was from. It was people movement oriented start things. It wasn't organization giving permission. I still can't really deal with the phrase a purpose, a permission giving organization. I'm like, it's just oxymoronic. Like if the organization gives you permission, it's not permission. They're just allowing you to do something. So the idea though in the evangelical thing that I was up to and was in was, I don't know, you just start stuff. I got into Christianity as a 17-year-old, not knowing anything. Within weeks had started a group at our high school, and within months had sued my school district for violating my constitutional rights of freedom of religion, and was just off and running. And I didn't know anything. So we're just making stuff up. And that all felt very gospel and very, no, that's kind of how it goes. And read the Gospels and the New Testament and Old Testament through that lens of participation in the creation of something. So then we meet theologians that are talking about God is the ultimate creative act, inviting people into the co-creative capacities. And like, oh yeah, for sure. Never thinking like, well, who's ordained us? And do we need to get permission from someone? Which usually then goes with, by the way, who's going to backstop this thing? Who's going to make sure we're safe and we're okay and we're good? And we're like, no, man, we're going down the river here on a homemade raft. And there's no, I don't know, we'll see how far we can go. That kind of attitude is a temperament as well as a theological vantage point that I've been trying to kind of delve into over the course of my years. Like what's temperament, what's condition, and what's a theological commitment. I'm unclear.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting thinking back on those days, Doug, how many people, I cannot tell you the number of times someone would say to me, well, you guys are just going to turn into a new denomination. Like, that's what you're going to do. That's what we were, they would just look down their noses at us. It was so dismissive. Like, oh yeah, the people who started our denomination, they were just like you guys. They weren't going to start. And look, now we're just a denomination with a headquarters and bylaws and a bureaucracy and, stuff like that. And there are other ways to organize in the world, And so we, for our 10-year run, we just organized very differently than a denomination would.
Yeah, and we could have chosen a denominational outcome for all emergent village stuff, and I don't know, it might have still been around. I don't know, but that was a trade-off not worth making. I used to have a conversation with a friend named Dan Kimball, and we would talk a lot about anchor metaphors. He was really into anchor metaphors, and he's like, well, what is this thing anchored into? I'm like, look, anchoring is really important for building a building because you have to have a foundation for which the structure is anchored to. It's a really dangerous thing for a boat. Like, anchors are meant to be temporary. You keep that anchor down when a storm comes in, and that boat is going to crash against the rocks that it's tethered to, right? You have to lift the anchor. Anchors are only temporary. And he's like, no, anchors are permanent. And I'm like, well, it depends if you're talking about a building or a boat. And I think the Christian faith can have buildings and boats. Like, why? So, like, all of that kind of argument was, man, it was painful and just constant. I mean, I don't want to give any impression that somehow we like figured something out early and we're executing a plan. We were tossing and tumbling our way through all of this and having near-on breakup fights about all of this all the way through. So you have a history of which people are coming and going because they were with it for a while and then weren't with it for a while. And while that was personally heartbreaking, I always thought, I don't know, how else do you think that happens? That's sort of how it goes. Like, it's good enough for now.
So I know a number of people would show up quite regularly and visit Solomon's Porch and then go hang out with after and try to figure out what the juice was. What you were up to. I mean, you published books both from Christianity Worth Believing and Thinking the Ideas, but also down to like, oh, here's my idea for how I'm going to do sermons and this kind of thing. For people that maybe weren't around then and aren't going to scroll back 1,200 episodes to when we discussed preaching and that kind of thing, what can you tell us what what a gathering in Solomon's Porch was like when you started, and the kind of transitions that happened in it. As someone who's kind of anchor phobic of sorts, that gives a kind of permission to be flexible that you don't have when the liturgy is already printed, but there is this 12 minutes, and you can rock it. You can rock as long as it ends on time.
Yeah. Be as free as you want inside this pulpit for 12 minutes. Yeah, look, we were willing at some, so then we started a church in January 2nd, 2000 officially. It was its wedding date, birth date. I don't know what to do with organizations, but it started officially that day. It ended, how do I not know the end date? It ended somewhere in October of 2023 officially. I left there in January of 2020. My role ended, and then it just ended a few weeks ago. Officially, like it doesn't exist anymore. Like it didn't officially exist before January 2nd, 2020, and it doesn't exist now. So, and in between it existed. That's sort of that. Because I don't bring that up because a lot of people are like, no, Solomon's Porch has just moved to the cloud. It's like death. Like grandma's not gone. She's just waiting for you. And like some people talk about our community like that, but it doesn't exist anymore. In the in-between time, we were very, when I say that we weren't interested in anchors, that didn't mean we weren't interested in very real, organized, tangible things. Like a boat is a very organized, complex structure. We weren't kids splashing around in the waves. Like we had a structure to a thing that was designed to move and be flexible and happen. So we created as many fresh expressions of the things we thought mattered. We thought being together every week mattered. We thought saying things of meaning out loud mattered. We thought calling people into action of service for one another, for themselves, and for the stranger mattered. We thought music mattered. So we made all of our own music. We made up our own structures. And I thought that talking about the Bible out loud was important. Specifically the Bible. I have lots of reflections on why I was so obsessed with talking about the Bible. So our sermons tended to be what we called an implicatory dialogical experience, right? So we had a particular kind of dialogue that was meant to drive us toward implication, not application. Really big deal for me for a long period of time. It still kind of is. Like I think a good story implicates you. A not good story has an application and a meaning you take away from it to direct you towards something else. But the point of a good story is that you feel now, what does that mean for me, right? So we're super interested in progressive or progressional, like something's going to move from not progressive in the conservative liberal sense, but that it's going somewhere. And so we wanted to have a way that people felt implicated in a conversation about the Bible and community and life that was going to be made by the people in the room as much as possible. So we came up with ways to do that. In our own sense, I kind of led a dialogical experience in the room, and we all worked on getting good at that. There's many versions that people can do in churches that involve more voices. One of the things I saw as a threat was giving too much power to any single voice to regularly tell people over and over how things that matter to them should be. And so, but it also meant you have to find, like, how do you find a way for people who have a lot to say as much as is reasonable, and people that only have a little bit to say those little bits of things in a way that's reasonable. And those were all considerations that we wanted to engage in. And we're trying to borrow lots of metaphors. You know, I didn't think the speech giving metaphor was the best metaphor for a sermon. I still don't. Partially because I think I'm good at speech giving, and I know the folly of it and the weakness of it. So I'm like, oh, what good's that going to do? And we were just in the early days of the internet, and we were saying things like, if you want a good speech about stuff, there's a lot of those. Go get one. What you don't get everywhere else, though, is this unique experience of these people in this room. And that was seen valuable by a very small sliver of people that were actually in that room. So a very small number of us really loved the sermony part. A lot of people just tolerated it, and a lot of people just, had to deal with it anyway. And there were lots of other things they liked. They liked the community. They liked the communion. They liked the music. They liked the art. They liked the kids roaming around. And other people hated every one of those things. Some people are like, I can't sing the music because you write it all in-house and it's a singer-songwriter style. And some people are like, hearing those kids make noise and move around, I can't think straight. And other people are like, this is like a mashup of arts that has no artistic vibe and thing. So everything that was an asset was also somebody's like pain in the ass, but all that created a special kind of motif. A woman named Phyllis Tickle, who took a real liking to us and started telling people about places like ours and kind of in a Phyllis Tickle way, saying to people, there's a picture of what the future could look like and it's in Minneapolis and you should go there. So that drove a lot of people to come look. And Tony, I may have told you this joke the very first time. I said, I think Solomon's Porch is like the biggest ball of twine. I think we were traveling somewhere when that notion struck me, which is a sightseeing effort somewhere in, I don't know if it's Nebraska or
no, it's in Darwin, Minnesota. I just drove through it on Saturday.
It was right before you got the roadkill turkey.
Yes.
That in the freezer section called the ditch.
Yeah.
Side of the road.
It's interesting. I think, publicity begets publicity.
Yeah.
And I think that, if the story in American religiosity right now is people leaving organized religion, leaving the church, whatever, at the time, we got media attention in the emergent movement because Doug and the others who were leading Solomon's Porch were doing such innovative things, and they lent themselves to florid prose in the New York Times and still photos of like that. This isn't your grandmother's church, headlines like that, a lot of those kind of things. And then, the people Doug called the looky-loos would show up. I mean, I remember times in Solomon's Porch where like an entire cohort of Episcopal bishops who were in Minneapolis for some meeting would all like march into Solomon's Porch and sit together on a couple couches. And it was funny. And Doug would always point them out.
Yeah.
In some ways kind of gently mocking them, but also then saying, everybody please, be polite. We've got a bunch of bishops in the house. Or whole confirmation classes from Lutheran churches would show up and go sit in the balcony, and then a lot of times people would stick around. We'd say, if Doug and I would kind of hold court at Original Pancake House on Monday mornings, where we would, for years, we met there every Monday. And if there were some erstwhile church planters in town, they would show up and, Doug would talk about church stuff and I would talk about theology stuff. And it was a heady time for sure. And then suddenly, the book contracts are flowing in, right? And other organizations wanted to partner with us, and we're getting flown to the God Box on Riverside Avenue or whatever in New York City to meet with all these muckety mucks. There was a lot of that. It was, I mean, I don't know that anything like that will ever happen again, frankly, because it was a pan-denominational attempt at church reform.
Yeah.
And it caught a lot of people's attention.
Yeah. And look, it was interesting. Like if there was a place like Solomon's Porch in Minneapolis, I would go there and look at it. Like right now, like I would, if there was a place like that anywhere, I think I would go look at it, right? That was like public enough and structured enough and hundreds of people enough and creativity and like, because there's a lot of creative things that happen, but they tend to be even more ethereal than our thing, it might be pop-up related or performance related, but it was a unique expression that was also hometowny, meaningful home cooking for a group of people in a room. Like it was just a great, great combination. And I remember thinking many, many days, how long can this thing keep going? It's just so good right now. Good things, can't just keep going. People change too much. And there was a particular makeup of a particular kind of goodness especially somewhere in 2012, 2007 to 2012, 15, somewhere in there. Like, it was just so good. It was so good. And, and now it's gone. So
what worked well? And do you have different reasons you would say it worked well now than when you were in the middle of it? Or maybe there are particular struggles that, after catching your breath and looking back, you'd go, oh, I wish I'd thought about X or done this differently.
We thought about everything we could think about and took everything with great consciousness. So we didn't give a lot of energy to everything. And there's some things that other churches spend a lot of time on that we spent no time on, but that wasn't flippant. We knew what we were up to and why that wasn't what we were doing. Like I mentioned that I was part of a big kind of traditional boomer, kind of early mega church that wasn't negative and exclusivist in a lot of ways before. And it was a very kind of management and not the purpose-driven life way, but kind of like intentional, big mega church. I worked there. Solomon's Porch didn't feel anything like that, but was as intentional. Like there was hardly a thing that if someone said, why is that way, that many people in our system wouldn't give a very robust answer to. So I think what made it work was there was a great commitment to integration as well as experimentation, and to feeling that this really matters to the people in this room, and we want to take this as seriously as we can. And I knew a lot of people had experienced trauma from the Bible. I didn't. I wasn't raised in it. It wasn't used oppressively on me. And when people would say things about the Bible that I thought were wrong, I'd just be like, this is not what it's about. Like, didn't bother me ever. It wasn't used as a weapon ever against me. And I knew that if people were going to overcome, I didn't know trauma language then, but now I know what we were doing was basically trauma-informed Bible study in a church context. And we were helping people to see and re-see these things that they had been so harmful to them, and to turn the light on a little bit and let the ghosts and the monsters go away. And it was very helpful for a very long time for a bunch of people. And then at some point it's not, so we were really like, we took it seriously. So I would say probably if anything was, look, we came up with a lot of creative stuff, and there was a ferocious creativity around that place at times that was just awe-inspiring, unrepeatable. It's like this old joke. I don't know my basketball very well, but there was a period of time when the joke was, look, the Minnesota Timberwolves are 2 players away from being an NBA championship team if those 2 players were LeBron James and Kobe Bryant. Like, that's all it's going to take, just 2 away. I go to these big churches, and we did this at Leadership Network, and we go around and we'd be like, oh, what's the secret of name your church Saddleback or Willow Creek or something? And it wasn't the system and the style and the structure. It was some unique characters in the place that were making magic happen. Like, that's how it goes. It's like that old joke from Best in Show, or Waiting for Guffman, one of those mockumentaries. The guy says, in school, people used to ask me if I was a class clown, and I would tell them no, but I sat behind the class clown and I studied him. Like, you can't study your way into creativity. So there was a unique moment of accidental and beautiful creativity and extremely good people at the stuff they did. And we had a very small budget, which helped us a lot. And I don't know, we were intentional and fortuitous in our creativity. And we came up with some pretty good stuff that I still think people could go through, Reimagining Spiritual Formation, a book that we wrote together about a week in the life of Solomon's Porch that I've looked back on. I'm like, that's really good. There's really good stuff in that thing that I wish more people would have taken account for. I've written 10 books that no one has read. So
I think I got 50 copies of the Body Prayer book. I used it with
give those away.
Lots of students.
I just want to double down on something that Doug said, as somebody who I'll put on my hat of somebody who wrote my doctoral dissertation on the movement. At a place like Solomon's Porch, I think it's hard to overstate this fact that there was nothing that wasn't thought about seriously. Like, even, let's not use the word church, or like every aspect of worship, every aspect of communal life. And there was nothing that was done on autopilot, which is so interesting because I had come from a big mainline church where I'd been on staff for 7 years as an associate pastor. And of course, there's a ton of things that are on autopilot. Just because, well, this church has been around for 50 years, and kind of like, well, our Christmas, should we change the time of the Christmas Eve service? I mean, should we bump it from 10 to 10:30? Like, these were the discussions. And at Solomon's Porch, it was like, I don't know, what should we do on Easter? Let's not look at what any other church does. Let's make up something completely ex novo, And I think when I was writing my dissertation on it, one of the things I thought was, now we're going to awkwardly talk about Doug while he's here, but the Marxist philosopher, Antonio Gramsci, Trip, he broke people who are kind of attempting revolutions down into two categories: traditional intellectuals and organic intellectuals. And Trip, people like you and me are traditional intellectuals because we've gone through we've got a terminal degree in more ways than one, a PhD. We've done a lot of schooling, and what schooling like that does is, frankly, it beats a lot of the innovative thinking out of you, because the only way you get a PhD is you ultimately figure out how to play by the rules of that school and the rules of academia, and you do all your footnotes correctly, and you format with inch margins, and you make sure all the professors are happy with everything you wrote. And Gramsci says that actual social movements start with organic intellectuals, and those are people who are really smart, but they're undertrained academically. So they haven't had all that innovation beaten out of them. And I think that people like, frankly, Doug and Brian McLaren and a lot of others on the list were that. They're obviously very smart. They were very savvy leaders. They're very charismatic individuals. Probably Bill Hybels is this guy too. Probably Rick Warren is this guy. This is what Doug's pointing to. Like, these are uniquely charismatic and very bright people who can read rooms, who understand what's going on. Rob Bell's one of these guys. I mean, if you watch Rob Bell talk to 3,000 people in a theater, you're like, that guy, there is something magic that cannot be taught, that this guy is reading the energy in this room and holding their attention for 2 hours while standing at a whiteboard talking about quantum physics. It's like, you can't teach that. That's something that's like a charism given by God or whatever. And so there was something about that there was magic. And then when we all got together for meetings, you had all these magic figures. Like Doug said, we would argue about stuff, but there was also a great deal of love and camaraderie and loyalty toward one another. And it was, so I think that's just some of my reflection on like what exactly it was. I don't know that listeners who've ever been to a traditional church can understand what it would be like to be in a community where there's nothing on autopilot, like literally. And last anecdote, I remember we're at the Emergent Theological Conversation with Miroslav Volf, and we're actually going to replay that audio on the stream for our patrons for the Emerge podcast. Oh. And I remember Volf he'd grown up Pentecostal in Croatia, and his dad was a Pentecostal pastor. But I remember he had just recently joined an Episcopal church, and he said at that event, Doug, I don't know if you remember this, but he said, I left evangelicalism and became Anglican because I realized you just can't make it up every week. You just, at some point, you just got to do the same thing every week. And I'm like, who says, like, we're surrounded by people who are literally making it up every week.
Based off his book, right? Like the funny thing about the theology conversations is it's a whole bunch of faith and community leaders who actually read the theologians' books before they get there. And they read that book, had better questions than his students, which he regularly pointed out.
Yes.
And they made it up every week.
Yeah, you can make it up every week. If you choose to, and if you want to. But Trip, can I tell you one more little backstory that something dawned on me, because this story that Tony and I are telling is true. And when you're making it up, it's coming from somewhere. And our desire was to try to get as many people to take whatever their past experience was and bring it to this community. So we never wanted to replicate ourselves or replicate some other place, but we wanted everything to be created out of the experience of the people who were in the space and the place. And we had ways to do that. There were techniques and styles that you do for community engagement. So our church, the Psalmist Porch, met on Sunday night. We tended to go through long sections of the Bible together as trauma-informed Bible sermoning. We wanted it to be discussion-based. We wanted it to be casual in setting, so it felt more like the kind of place where you would talk about things that matter. So what we wanted to do is have a very ordinary place where we talked about special things rather than a special place that we tried to make normal by talking about normal things. And a lot of churches I go to are very special. Everything about it is special, the time we meet in the formal setting. And then some pastor gets up and tries to make things real normal. Like, let me just talk about life, so they try to take a special place and make it normal. And we tried to take a normal place and talk about things that we thought were significant, special to human experience. Okay, so this is what we're up to. I did it speaking on a stool, partly because we wanted to meet in the round, and partly because I'm very tall. So I wanted to sit down so I was closer, so people's necks literally wouldn't hurt standing up.
Yes.
Remember sitting
shorter, thick males don't prefer to sit in a stool where people do see the backside of them.
And you can get frumpy because you lean over and look frumpy, where I could pull my big long legs up and look sort of contortioned on this crazy little stool. It was a shtick, right?
Yeah.
I remember one night spinning around in the stool, and we had these sofas and couches and stuff sitting around and a little end table. And this high school kid was sitting there with his feet up on the table, and he didn't have any shoes on. And when I swung by, this is like 2014. We are 14 years into this thing. In a flash, it dawns on me. This is me in 1983 at Valley Baptist Church. I'd come into Christianity in April, and in July, I'm at an independent fundamentalist Baptist church that was just in the neighborhood where we lived. Found out that they had a Sunday night service. So my now wife, her sister, my two best friends, a whole gaggle of us would all go to this church on Sunday nights. We didn't know there was a difference between Sunday morning and Sunday night. We show up at this independent fundamentalist Baptist church in the summer in our shorts, tank tops, and flip-flops. We would sit in the front row, put our feet up on the little modesty bench in front of us, and in the middle of Pastor Tucker giving sermons, we'd raise our hands and ask him questions, having no idea that you didn't do that. He loved us. We loved it. It was a Baptist church with their Sunday night Bible study, right? I spin around on this stool, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh my goodness. There's a 16-year-old kid sitting in this place with his feet up, and that peculiar experience from my own story, we had created a way to make that normative and acceptable. We were later, by fall of that year, we were kicked out of that church because people didn't want us around. I had almost forgotten about that church and that depth of that experience until I saw this kid, and all of a sudden I'm like, I think I've been trying to create a place to fulfill that earliest spiritual experience that was so life-giving for me. Like, I knew something deep in me. Funny enough, I've talked to a bunch of people who have started churches around the same time that we did. Pete Rollins and I had this conversation. Mark Driscoll and I had this conversation. Dan Kimball, a whole bunch of people who I knew converted into Christianity or had a revolutionary experience in high school. And I've been like, how much of your early church starting experiences do you think really is a reflection of you trying to make normative and deal with your own early day? And to a person, they're all like, oh, for sure. That is. So I want to be clear that like some of this is subconscious. And other people are trying to reconcile, like they grew up in churches with a different story and a different childhood spiritual experience, and they're trying to normalize that. So they've created a formal environment or something with systems and structures, and that's what they're wrestling with. And so I just think a lot of this stuff is biography of individual people who are making something happen. So it's some of it's sociological, theological, cultural, and very intentional, and some of it's like just happened to be the thing that we were into, and that's not attractive to look. Of all the people who came to Solomon's Porch, and there were a lot, we cycled through a lot of people. Per capita, we had more visitors than any church I've ever seen for the size of the church. Like it was busloads. Almost all those people never came back. Like the number of people who came back, I don't know, Tony, we're talking 0.05% maybe of all the people who ever came to a Solomon's Porch gathering ever came back again. Like it was not for everyone. It was mostly for almost no one. Just enough hundreds of people to kind of keep the thing alive, but it was not universally attractive. We were not.
Oh no,
we were not the solution to the problem.
In fact, I think one of the ironies of the fact that it was started in large part by Leadership Network, this group in Dallas, this foundation that had kind of discovered Bill Hybels and Rick Warren and broadcast the successes of the seeker-sensitive big box suburban church in the 80s and the early 90s, was that when you'd go to a place like Solomon's Porch, and this was the case at at Journey in Dallas, I think this was the case at Common Table in DC, a lot of the emerging churches, you know how at a traditional church they'll be like, well, the back rows, visitors should be able to kind of sneak in and be anonymous, and it should be a little bit darker. Maybe those back rows are under the balcony because people don't feel comfortable walking in to a thing where everybody looks at them. And if you came to Solomon's Porch, every head turned, or if you had to get up and go to the bathroom in the middle of and these worship gatherings were 2 hours long. If you had to get up, the lights were on full. There was no hiding. And plus you'd never heard a single one of the songs before. Like all this stuff, and I hadn't come out of this, but all the stuff that Doug had come out of in the seeker-sensitive evangelical movement, which was like lower the bar, lower the bar, lower the bar. What's it? Saddleback Sam and Saddleback Sally, right? You want them to feel so welcome when they come that there's nothing that makes them uncomfortable. And you'd go to a place like Solomon's Porch or a lot of these emergent churches, and a lot of the stuff would make you uncomfortable because you were just out of your depth. So probably for certain people with, I don't know, certain Enneagram numbers or personality traits or whatever, they were just like, people would come in and they'd leave within minutes.
Yes.
Then I can't handle this.
Thank you. Good night.
Yeah. So it was like everything was always raising the bar. This
was a 9-minute service. I'm sorry. We made other plans. I've only been here for 10 minutes. It's time for us to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was raising the bar. And it was also like, I don't know, like someone would invite you to dinner at their house if you were a visitor, right? It was that kind of weird thing. And a lot of people like would show up. This is not an exaggeration. Like, hey, weren't you here last week? And like, yeah, this is my second week. All right, would you mind doing this or that? Could you be like, we just made people in charge of stuff week 2, right? Because that was a way of community inclusion in certain organizing principles, as opposed to maybe after a while, you're here long enough and you've been vetted and you feel like you're safe. And now you're somebody that could be trustworthy and we'll send you through a membership process. It was just different. And it had real weaknesses and real benefits, but I would pick it 1,000 days out of 1,000 days.
Yeah. Oh, when you mention that kind of role of certain individuals being able to having a certain charismatic side to them that can really hold an audience and community and these kinds of things. Multiple. I've had the fear of being stuck, being your successor, Doug, mentioned by multiple of your friends. I think both Nadia and Tim Conder both said that would be one of the scariest things. Tony would probably be freaked out. Like, this is one of those elements when you think of Solomon's Porch, the role it played for so many people, between our ages and the movement and such, thinking about church, rethinking the sermon, all this kind of stuff. There's also the not just my body shape doesn't really set up for a stool in the middle of the room. Then they would have left in 7 minutes, not 9. But there's also that kind of a personality with enough energy to give permission to people to risk trying something that's demanding in a way your average service isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that, like, is that kind of dynamism, is that something you were aware of early on? Did it start to make more sense? Did it make more sense after you stepped away from being part of the church, or after you started, putting more time in some of your other projects and such?
Well, thanks for that. It's a kind compliment. And also, I mean, I wish some of those people had taken over for me when I left and would be my successor. Maybe it would still be around. Yeah, look, I was aware of a social dynamism and personal leadership capacity probably from age 17 forward. I remember speaking, I don't know, I couldn't have been very old. I might have been 21, 22, and was preaching at the church that I was interning at, this big mega church, in front of thousands of people. Like, unbelievable that the pastor there named Leith Anderson let me do that stuff as a college intern or a seminary intern or whatever I was. And, so young. And I mean, I've been in Christianity for 5 years, I'm like, hey, why don't you go ahead and do the 4 services on Sunday? And people listened. And I remember standing there because I didn't grow up going to churches. I didn't even know how this stuff looked, what people did. And I remember in the middle of a sermon thinking, why are these people listening to me? And realized I had them hooked, take them where I want. I realized, okay, that's a thing a person can do. I've seen other people do that thing, and I could do that thing. And I would speak at youth camps and lots of contexts in which I'm like, oh, and I started to refine that capacity and skill and test that. And so there was a lot of that charisma of being in front of people thing that I knew I could do. Tony, I don't even know if you know this, if I ever said it when you were around or told you, but I grew up with a stutter. I was a pretty big stutterer, especially reading. If I ever had to read out loud, oh my gosh, I couldn't read out loud well, and I would really stutter. So we do a lot of reading stuff out loud at Solomon's Porch, because I was like, oh, I'm going to work on that. I'm going to work on the stutter and being able to, speak and do that. There was some internal kind of work, oh, maybe this is an arena. And I've never gone to a therapist about stuff, but it wasn't like a therapeutic, oh, you should probably speak more in front of people to get over whatever causes a stutter. I don't even know. But I would talk really fast because that was a way to alleviate a stutter. So there was a lot of other stuff going on, yeah, I recognize I have leadership capacities, but also I'm trying to figure out how to do this thing. And I don't, and what can you get away with just by hustle, as an athlete that wasn't all that skilled, but just tried really hard, had a lot of diligence and, a lot of stick-to-itiveness and that. So all of that is part of whatever charisma-ish thing there is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're not alone in that, because each one of, I profiled 8 churches in my dissertation, 8 emergent churches, and each one of them had a very charismatic and gifted leader. So, I mean, of course it did not. I was one of those people who, after seeing what happened after you left Leadership Network and somebody tried to fill your shoes and that didn't go well, I was like, yeah, don't ever follow Doug Pagitt into a job, because you're just a big personality and you have a lot of gifts, and you're physically big, and you're funny and winsome and all that. But so I wonder, I don't know if you've talked about this publicly, and if you don't want to talk about it, don't. But now that Solomon's Porch has ceased to exist, I mean, clearly it's one of it's one of the cornerstones of your life. It's going to be like probably the first line of your obituary. How do you feel? How do you feel now that it's closed? And we're going to we have audio from the final gathering that we're going to use in Emerged. Our producer, Josh, was there, and he told me it was incredibly powerful, many tears. But wonderful. I'm not just even wondering about that night, but how's it been since, or watching it die? As much as you want to talk about that.
Yeah. And I've been trying to use non-living entity narratives for it. Like, it started, it wasn't born, it ended, it didn't die. I don't know why I'm doing that, but I am. So, because it just feels more accurate to me, like as an organization, there was a thing. I stopped my role in January of 2020, just months before the pandemic kicked in. So all of that pandemic-related stuff and all of the Minneapolis-related responses to the murder of George Floyd by the police officers here, all of that came while I wasn't in that role. And they were in the process of hiring a new person to take over for me. So that was kind of a period. The last 3 years, now almost 4 years, was a period of time that I wasn't there. But there's also a sense that somewhere around 2015 to 2017, maybe 2018, somewhere in there, I was also realizing there are many iterations of Solomon's Porch that have all passed by, and none of those are repeatable again. So I had a really wonderful time of kind of thinking back on the eras when there was something super wonderful, and knowing, okay, the latter days of this are going to be really different than those middle days and then those early days. And so there was some of that kind of grieving. It feels better to me now that it's not still struggling, because it hit a struggle point from the time I left for a lot of reasons, some of which were cultural and some of which were part of the community and some of which were leadership. But it was in struggle. And I felt a burden while it was struggling to know what to do. I don't feel that burden anymore, because there's a finality to it not existing. The same relief that I felt before starting Solomon's Porch, when I was working at Leadership Network and traveling, or when I was in 1992, when Gary Gaetti, the Minnesota Twin, just after winning the World Series, had a bunch of money and met with me and said, I want to start a church and I want you to do it, and we're going to do it in this mall. That started me thinking about starting a church in 1992. By the time we started Solomon's Porch 8 years later, there was like a relief that we had started something, like there was a pressure building, and this was the release. In the last 4 years, there was a lot of pressure about my leaving and how I did, and and now that's kind of over, because it's just complete. Like, no one has to be fussing with it anymore and all that. So I feel that, like, real gratitude, but also personally just a lot of like, oh, this is better than it felt for the last 4 years. Because I didn't know if I should do something or not. Is it? I don't know. There was so much. I never felt a lack of uncertainty while it was happening, the church, and I felt a lot of that over the last 4 years. And that I'm not built for that. Like that creates tension in me that's different than other things. Like, I can handle a lot of the people like, hey, we're leaving and it's because of you. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, here we go. But like the powerlessness of just watching something struggle and thinking, I don't know, am I supposed to be doing something right now? I don't even know who to talk to. Like that was terrible. So I don't know. I feel just, I'm kind of like, it's real, and it was a great thing. And maybe that's just time. Maybe it's like, I don't know, 4 years. Okay. So Tim Condor said to me once when he was leaving his church, he said, I've always believed, so people say stuff like that, I've always believed it's better to leave 1 month too early than 10 minutes too late. Okay. So he said that to me. I don't know where I was in my contemplation of leaving. I remember mentioning that to Nadia. She said, I got to go, hung up. And within days, I think she was making a decision to oh no, I've got to act on that. And when she did that, then that caused me to start thinking, have I stayed too long? And then I was in this panicky moment of all that. So I don't know, some little casual comment by somebody just ricocheted around my world of there was so much work, Tony, going into training people on how to start and almost no help in knowing when to leave or when to end. That's a curious thing. There was a piece of the puzzle we didn't, was stuck under the couch. We never put in the frame. How do you stop something? How do you end something? I don't know. I still don't know that. I'm too conflict avoidant for that. I've realized I'm really opinionated and don't really care and can be real 8-hole about things as an Enneagram 8, but I'm also really conflict avoidant. So that's not a great combination for certain conditions.
In that, when you leave full-time ministry, all of a sudden there are rhythms in your life that disappear. And I wonder, as someone who is finishing up high school and watches a probably theologically atrocious, inspired passion play, and then decided, oh, this is a compelling story, I think I'm going to give my life to it, and then starts a church, is helping organize a large movement and things. How has not getting to walk into the center of a room around a stool and have to be prepared to know the lives of those people and what's going on in the text, how's that changed your relationship with scripture, tradition, worship? Have you learned something about who you are coming out that changes your relationship to a tradition that you were invested so deeply you had to start, create, innovate?
Yeah, brilliant question. Look,
I think so too.
I miss it deeply. I would love to be in a place that feels, smells, sounds like that. I'm involved in another church now. I'm trying to take on a different role and be supportive of a pastor that I like a lot and who's young and trying to do a thing. But it doesn't smell or feel like Solomon's Porch kind of at all, which is a bit of a break. Another church my wife likes more. We've been sort of kicking around there. It feels a little too close, and I'm like, oh, this is stirring up all my sads, and I don't need any of that. And then it's not quite what it was either, but it's really close. It kind of looks like it. It's super hard, and I still want a community where there's music, where there's creativity, where we talk about important things, where we compel one another to act in the world. I've tried to recreate some of that in the work I do with Vote Common Good and Greater Things and that. And I talk into a microphone a lot to the internet about stuff, I think, which alleviates a little bit of that. Just how do you get thoughts out of your head in front of people? Piece, but no, it's a profound gap. It's like having a tooth pulled. Like there's a missing thing there that I can feel every single time I pay attention to my gum line. And I know it's just an emptiness and a loss. I know some people who are pastors and they're like, oh, I don't know, I haven't missed it since. Well, I get that. But I never thought I had a job that was performing a duty. I thought I was part of a community and had a role in the community, and would have liked to have continued to have a role in that very same community the whole time. It's something I really thought was going to happen and was not the preference of the person who took over after me. So I didn't. But so I've been, I would love to be in some kind of a community. So much so that I go places on Sunday mornings. Terrible time for a meeting Sunday morning. I can see why churches take it because it's kind of the last spot, that anybody would choose to have a meeting. Would you guys take that 10 a.m. slot? Sundays. It's
So
all yours. No competition.
yeah. Well, so there are a couple images or ideas that I heard you give in talks probably 30 times.
Oh.
And and some of them stuck with me for a long time, and I'd love to, like, well, I don't know if we'll get to them all or anything, but I'm interested in how they feel in the present. One of the first times when in divinity school, when you're doing the kind of unclogging the drain of your theological imagination, and you find out all the places it's backed up and it's uncomfortable and smells and is blowing out. I when I heard you preach for the first time, it was the first time I heard you do the adoption metaphor, and you talk about the church that Solomon's Porch runs, and use this adoption metaphor where a lot of people, when they think about joining a church, oh, well, we're going to tell you how to be one, and we look at new members and go, well, now that you've joined us, we have to relearn who we are with you. And you told stories then about young children who you and Shelley had adopted into the family, and such. And thinking back, on the timeline, that would have been in like right after Solomon's Porch kind of explodes, and Phyllis is like, go see the future of the church, and this kind of thing. Like, having been a part of the lives of both your actual children that adopted and changed your life, and all the people who came in and out of Solomon's Porch. What do you think of? How do you see that in the present? When the experience and joys and pains of being a member of a family that's constantly having to reevaluate itself. Yeah.
Well, thanks for remembering that. Yeah, this metaphor was that because my wife and I and our two children at the time adopted the children who lived next door to us in a foster home, and we'd been friends with them for about a year, and then they moved from being neighbors and friends into our house as family members. One of the things that we recognized at the point was that we didn't just become 1/3 larger as a family. We brought in new members to the family who are going to reshape the family. And they're going to now direct what does a Pagitt look like, and who is a Pagitt, and how do we now live with each other, and what are the preferences and capacities and things they want to avoid that we need to include in our family. So we didn't just become 1/3 larger, we became a new people with new capacities, new weaknesses and all. And that picture is something I thought organizations could take on, especially churches could become new communities when new people form them or join them. So the act of joining is a participation act, not an extension of, oh, now our idea, notion, brand, belief has 2 more adherents. We became a new set of people. So if you're going to do that in a family, you have to figure out, how do you do that? And what are you willing to give up? And how do we blend the names? And there was a lot that went into that, and still does. And now, those children are 30 and 32 years old, and 32 and 33 are the ages of our children that have been in our family, because we birthed them, Shelley birthed them. So, I don't know, that's a whole other kind of family. And 2 of our grandkids come from one of the adopted ones. And so they now are living out a whole other story as a part of this family. It doesn't know anything about the other piece of the story, right? It's now extending further and further. And then one of them has married someone, and now she's in the family, and now she's extending us, and she carries around our name. And our biological daughter, who married somebody else, now doesn't have our name. And so the name gets worked around, and that's how it goes. And I love that picture of who's in and who's out, and by what name, and how do people associate. It's really confusing. Families are dynamic and confusing. That's what I want in a faith community. This church that I'm choosing to be part of, I went to the little membership information meeting on Sunday. They didn't talk about it like that. They didn't say, hey, if you 11 people become part of this thing, just imagine we've become a new people in a whole new way, and you should bring something. And what do you have, and what's in your mix, and what's your favorite meal? And hey, here's a thing we all say that we believe, kicks back to the apostles. What are some things you believe that now become part of our collective belief around here because you've brought them in? Like, that's not a part of the conversation. I'd like it to be, so I'm going to nudge and try to see if I can get a little bit of that, like a different metaphor, not joining the health club by which now we have 2 more members that we have to accommodate, but how do you join a community of family where you make and remake it? Still the thing I believe about Christianity. I think our invitation in is not to be a disciple, but to be a community member. And we should shape this faith, and it becomes a different faith because you're part of it, is something I've always held to and have wanted to be true, and have tried to create theological rationale for it. So yeah, I'm still all for that. It's more complicated. Pagitts are also a Trump supporting group of people, right? I'm not, but I promise you, there's some people in the family that are. So what do the Pagitts believe about that? Well, it depends on which one you ask.
Yeah.
I love that. I think that's, I only love it because that's like how it is, right? And everything else is a fiction that tells you, like, no, here's what we're up to and into. So
the one of the moments in my head when I think of you and Tony's friendship is, well, one, both of you enjoy arguing with each other, and probably receive the other ones telling they find you utterly uncompelling and wrong as like a sign of affirmation.
Mhm.
And quite regularly y'all would make whole audiences awkward by pressing the other one back and forth, which there's one that's very memorable to me, and I'm interested in how differently it would go now. This was at the theological conversation with Moltmann. And Tony was talking to Moltmann, and I could not hold it anymore. I had to run to the bathroom, and you kind of were sitting in the back doing your stalk, like, I hope he ends on time so I can get up there to make sure things transition, because at this point y'all are running the event and such. And Jürgen Moltmann, Tony are talking about how without Jesus they have no idea what they would do with God. Like, they probably wouldn't believe in God, definitely wouldn't know about investing in it. Like, they're discussing his book Crucified God. Like, without Jesus, God's like just a bankrupt waste of a time. Well, and I'm trying to go to the bathroom, and you grab my arm, and you're like, Tripp, you hear this stuff? What is this? Like, you need Jesus in order to have God. I mean, look, I love Jesus. He's great, high quality material, and you're like, I'm not like throwing Jesus under the bus here, but come on, like, if he just disappeared, like, we'd still, like, there's still God. And I'm like, I'm trying to pee, and I'm like, I don't know, we should definitely bring this up later. So then during one of the meals, I'm basically like, Tony, Doug's worried about you, that your connection to God is so fragile. Like, no Jesus, no God. And since Tony's new book's coming out, and he has a whole chapter talking about God, no Jesus, I'm just thinking this might be an opportunity for Tony to tell you right.
You're funny,
Hey,
Tripp.
buddy.
High
quality book, God in Wild Places, pre-order now.
Pre-order now.
What we were doing with Moltmann was this thing called Christian theology, which sometimes was lost on Doug. And we, there were always things at Solomon's Porch that drove me batty, like Doug baptizing people, as many people at times as they wanted to be baptized, which was something that probably wouldn't bother me as much now as it did then. But there were these questions I would have of, like, how this innovative leadership, how far is too far? Like, if you're not practicing Orthodox Christianity by many people's standards, if you engage in multiple baptisms, what's wrong with one baptism and then a reaffirmation of baptism? But Doug was always an outside the box thinker enough that he'd be like, fuck it, I don't need to, I don't need to go with one baptism. I can baptize these people in this lake every year, and people would get baptized every year. So but look, hopefully that not only didn't end our friendship, it didn't end my commitment as a participant in Solomon's Porch. I just didn't go to those lake baptisms because I was like, I'm just going to opt out of this one small aspect of this life in this community that's being built by these people and being led by Doug. I mean, that was Doug had a leadership role, even though he's a member of the community. And I just was like, well, I'm not going to break fellowship over that. We're not going to schism over that. I'm not going to write a treatise and post it on the door about how everybody should leave Solomon's Porch until Doug starts practicing one baptism. There's not going to be an HBO documentary on the cult leader who practiced multiple baptisms or whatever, Yeah, so I think there were a lot of people in that, and I think a lot of people do that with whatever churches they're in. You talk to people all the time who are like, yeah, I don't believe in the virgin birth, but we stand up every week and say the Apostles' Creed, and I just kind of mumble that part. That's what people do when they're committed and invested in a group of people. They just are like, well, not everything's going to go my way. It's back to Doug's metaphor of family. That's I've got Trump supporters in my progeny as well.
Yeah.
And I don't like it, but I love them.
Yep. I remember one time we used to have open communion, and that meant anyone could have communion, anyone could serve communion, and anyone could introduce communion in their own way and tell people what they thought it was. And one time I think Tony was introducing communion. I don't remember, Tony, now if I was there or if I just remember
you were out of town. Yeah.
And there were some people there from another church run by someone named John Piper, and they were there sort of looking at what we were doing and fussing around. And Tony introduces does a sermon, I think, and there was no real pushback, and then introduces communion. And just before everybody's going to get up, we do it house party style. So people would move around, and there'd be loaves of bread and wine and juice and all over, and there's music playing, and it was more of a house party than it was a solemn experience. And this person interrupts and says, if you preach, if you don't preach the gospel properly and you take communion, you're eating and drinking condemnation unto yourself, and kind of proclaims this, yelling from the balcony. And Tony looks, sees the person do it. The room gets quiet. Lots of people in there, tension's rising. And Tony goes, and there's another opinion about how communion is. So if you want that one, go ahead and talk to the folks in the balcony, but go ahead and share communion with each other. Something like this. So yeah. And like that idea of like, yeah, okay, that too, that's a perspective, and you may or may not hold it. But that's up to you, right? Like, why would I baptize people who want to be baptized more than once? Because they wanted to be. And if they asked me what they should do, I'd be glad to give them my input. But if they didn't want it, then I don't know. Like, it wasn't something I cared about too much, and the meaning that it carried for them. And I actually think that, our baptism should be considered more like ancient Jewish baptisms than like circumcision, which is a one-time action. And it should be more like a purification, cleansing process. So I'm actually a true Baptist. But it didn't matter. Who cares? Does it matter to you because you're part of the family, and this guy in the balcony that's yelling down for that day, he was part of it too. And there was a perspective that was made available to people. And so it goes. Because I just think I think human agency is the most important, one of the more important parts of human spirituality.
Yeah.
I don't know if I believe in freedom, but I think I believe in agency. I'm not sure what the difference is, but I don't know if there's human freedom or not.
Well, I'm not going to take that bait, Doug. I'm not going to take the bait. It's a dangerous aside. Tony, he just said, I don't know if I believe in freedom, but I believe in agency, and I just want you to know those. Sometimes
you just taunt. You just taunt a person with a. Like if Pete was on here, I'd be like, I don't know if I believe in psychoanalysis or not, but I think there's probably something to figure out the rift that we all have in it, but I don't know if psychoanalysis.
Well, I don't know if it's really good for understanding human psychology, but it sets up for really cool movie reviews.
That's perfect.
This is one of the things about Doug that Doug would do even in sermons, and you just don't. One of the things we talked about early in Emergent and that became a real theme was a phrase that I learned from Nancy Murphy, and then I think I'll take credit for bringing it to Emergent: epistemic humility, because it's what I saw. I mean, most of us, mainline or evangelical, grew up with preachers speaking in tones of certainty. You don't stand up in a pulpit for 20 minutes, no matter the kind of church, and just be like, well, I don't really know. I mean, I'm kind of thinking this through. So stuff like this, like, I don't think I believe in human freedom, but I think I believe in agency. Be like, Doug is working out his stuff in real time in a community of people. And that was just yet another difference between the kind of churches that we'd all grown up in and the kind of communities that were being formed all around the country, frankly, around the world, in the emergent movement.
So here's a question I'd love. I think it's a good one to end on for both, and I'd love for both of you to talk about it. When you think of the story that's being told in the Emerged series of the emerging church movement, and then the narrative of Solomon's Porch, what do you think are the best questions to ask when looking at that kind of period of time and what's going on? What were the points where if you went back, you might think, oh, well, maybe it was this. Like, there are a number of people that emphasize the big shift in 2008 after Obama's election, where Brian does everything must change, and you get a kind of political turn right after a couple theological things, right, where then the larger emerging conversation starts splintering into streams and all that kind of stuff. And you've kind of told about these moments and shifts in the life of the story of Solomon's Porch. When you look back, like, are there particular turning points or decisions that kind of turned out to be a lot bigger than they were in the moment?
Well, I mean, I think for the movement, there were some real turning points, and I think we'll talk about a lot of these in the Emerged podcast when we release it next year. One was Doug going to Leadership Network, and it's interesting, Doug. I mean, there's a section in episode 1 of the Emerged podcast with different people being like, you just knew you had to meet Doug Pagitt. Like Tim Condor. Yeah. Tim Condor says that. I think Danielle Schroyer says it. It was kind of like Doug's the gravitational center of something that's happening. So if you can get into that, solar system, like, that's where the action is. And you were at the center of that. And then I think when Doug left Leadership Network in 99, it was the beginning of a real change. A change for the better, because we moved out. It was like kids leaving the house, and we had to go make it get our own apartment, figure out how to pay our own bills. That was a big change. I think another turning point was doing the Emergent Convention in 2003 in San Diego was huge for all of us.
Yeah.
It was like a coming out party. If in 99, 2000, we were kids moving out of the house, that was like our big wedding in 2003 that all the guests came to, and people, the buzz that was generated after that event was extraordinary. And then I'd think, when you look ahead to like 2008, 2009 or whatever, when Emergent Village is kind of floundering and ultimately shutting down as an organization, that was another big change. It didn't happen. That one didn't really happen overnight. Kind of like Solomon's Porch didn't cease existing overnight. It happened. There was kind of a denouement period, and we end well? Probably not. We never really thought about that, So those are some things that come to mind that in the timeline for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Right on. That's look, there were a lot of dynamics going on that not all of us who had different levels of influence always knew. I remember Tony, I remember many days standing up in my bedroom when we had many kids in the house. We had 4 teenage kids during a lot of this time, elementary school and teenage kids. So I had to, sneak into my bedroom and be on the phone with you. And we're trying to figure this all out and like realizing we don't have any money. We're even paying for our own phone calls. Like we're paying for our own travel. Like people thought there was all this money around because there were books and stuff. And I'm like, oh, it's how much work it is to make a book to be paid $2,500, for some retainer. Like it's crazy how much mismatch there was between what the perception thought all of this was and reasons why they would think that, and what the actuality was of how this was happening. We used to have this phrase like, who's willing to sleep on the floor for this idea, which sometimes literally meant going to someone's house and sleeping on the floor or staying in their kid's bedroom while their kid went and slept on their parents' floor, they give us the bed. Like it was so scraping by, even the emergent village conventions, the emergent conventions were like, it was a little bit of money to make some of that stuff happen, but man, we were just tumbling trying to figure that stuff out. So there was a real, I don't know, different opinions from the inside versus the outside about what this all was and where the power was and how all this could go. And man, we were all just trying to get along. Tony, in your marriage and a lot of the marriages of the people involved in this, my own family life with kids that were struggling in their older elementary and teenage years, like stuff at home was on fire, and we're doing all this and traveling around and being gone. And like, so I don't know. I don't remember exactly where the question was, Trip, but I'll just say like that was a big part of a lot of this stuff that was just tumult of personal life and frustration. And then people leaving and people getting mad and early versions of cancel culture and just stuff like, wow, there was so much angst in the air around all of this all of the time with no real plan and constantly having meetings trying to figure out how we could get money from, some foundation funded by the Lilly Pharmaceutical nonprofit, downside, like writing grants and just trying to come up with stuff and trying to have meetings and turning over leadership to all kinds of people and starting cohorts and just like wild levels of inefficiencies. And so I don't know. I guess that's what I think back both of the fond flag post moments and in between just the wind, little wind dirt devils just spinning around of this whole thing. Like, what are we even doing? And having our, people, our spouses say to us like, are you guys spending all your time doing this? Like, shouldn't you go get a real job or couldn't you be able to do a thing? Like it was very emotionally and financially and lifetime spent costly, for all of us. But Tony, you and I, as much as anyone in it, we were,
Oh yeah,
we were.
But I think what that's indicative of, Doug, is how much we believed in it.
Totally.
Like we really, really believed. I think now working on the emerged, like we never would have said, it would have been the height of hubris to say we think we're doing what Martin Luther did, like or what Jonathan Edwards did. Like we're trying to start a reformation or at least a revival, like to actually change the church. I mean, we said, we're here to change the church, but we wouldn't compare ourselves to Luther. But I look back now and like, I don't think our goals were any smaller than what Luther was trying to do. I mean, we were trying to reform the church and, we didn't succeed at that. Mm-hmm. In as a thoroughgoing way as Luther did, but that's what we were up to. It was, maybe it was terribly arrogant, but we really believed it. We really thought we were gonna move the needle. I don't think we knew how intransigent and monolithic the church still is, like it would, like so many churches, particularly in the main line, would rather die than change. Like that's just the institutional psychology of them. The individual people want to change, but there's no ability to change at the institutional level. So yeah, the fact that we slept on each other's couches and we all got to know each other's kids, we opened homes to strangers would come to town whom we had never met, and we couldn't vet them by looking up their their last 10 tweets. Like, that didn't exist. We just said, yeah, I mean, you can sleep in my kid's bedroom.
Yeah, maybe we got in my house. Yeah.
We got to pull out. We got an air mattress. We'll blow it up.
Crazy. Yeah.
And we had spouses who rolled with it, and kids who were brought up in this very dynamic, fluid vibe.
Like, it'd be interesting to pull some of our kids together and just how they would reflect on any memories they have of that stuff, and what my dad was up to. I remember my daughter, who graduated from high school in 2008, she went to college in 2009, the fall of 2008. I think in 2009, she took a religion class, and Tony and I were on the syllabus of the religion class. And she's like, talking about my dad?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, you're Mashawn Pagitt? Oh, huh.
Your dad writes about you in this book.
Yeah, like, oh, that's interesting. And she's like, how do you know about like this? Like, they knew it, but didn't really know it. And kind of, that kid thing. It was a mess in a beautiful and like sincere way. And, I would do it again. Tony, would you, if you had the chance?
Yeah, oh my
Back to
God.
the Future,
I mean, it was just absolutely.
I wouldn't go correct. I wouldn't go fix anything with a DeLorean to unravel any of that.
No.
I mean, we could figure out how to be better at it, but probably only marginally.
Well, the real question is, would yourself 10 years ago take your own advice?
Yeah,
that's
for sure. Yeah,
doubtful.
I've thought a lot about would I go to a church that's run by someone like me on January 2nd, 2000, or am I too refined for that?
Mm-hmm. Like, even mentioning the kind of love and energy that comes from all that stuff, and the way people that are, I don't know what you'd call them, like, a part of it, but not organizing it. It's not their sweat equity that happens when you do the gathering, or you do the networking, or setting up the cohorts, or building the stuff online to connect people, or answering the calls all week and all that. The past couple of weeks, I've been reading all of the messages from people that came to Theology Beer Camp, which I hope, Doug, you can come next year, because I had two different people give me, which I experienced as the nicest compliment, that I haven't been at something that nerdy and that Christian since one of the big Emergent Village events.
Wow.
And to me, as someone that thought, oh, why shouldn't I? Why shouldn't I? Now there's this new thing on the internet called the podcast. Why shouldn't I just like figure out how to do it and tell everyone they should listen to it? And why shouldn't I talk a bunch of breweries into sending me beer so I can day drink and talk about theology with people? And why should like that kind of thing? And and people will note like, oh, it's and I emailed one of them back and said, well, what was it? And they were like, well, basically, like, all the podcasters and all the speakers are your friends.
Yeah.
And so it just has a very different energy.
Yep.
And then the people that had come are connected to like, oh, they listened to your podcast and maybe this other one, or they read this. And so you're facilitating a space, but where you come there and like you get to celebrate the fact that you carry certain questions or intuitions, that you have these connections elsewhere. But like part of what you're doing is hosting this energy for people that don't have that community in the present. Right, that's the time they have it, and both at Emergent events, at the Joe Pa events, the company when you ran events together, and I try. One of the things I noticed at ours is there's always like way more clergy at them than other events that are similar, unless it's like a denominational event, and they're there because their church doesn't even give it to them, and it's like, oh, I'm on the DL, I'm not going to rock the collar here, And I just say that as more like as a kind of affirmation and thank you, because I emerged, and there's a D on the end of it, and where to end up going. But I think for a lot of people who were parts of it in different spaces, it made us think, well, yeah, the majority of churches have no interest in changing, like most institutions or political parties or all these other kinds of things. But the animating center of it is something that's worth giving yourself to, even if you don't know what the form of it or the expression is going to look like.
Right on.
And one of the things I hope with Emerged is that more of the people who kind of share that energy and frustration and questions in the present, get the overconfidence and just enough hubris to try new things, where people that wish they had a community to be in, or a space to be in, or a place to be heard, get it. And that's the thing I think I'm most excited about and celebrating and going through it. And hopefully, some of the younger listeners, who wants to, everyone knows now how big a waste it could be to spend all this money going in debt to get a liberal arts degree. Now you could just start a church.
Right. Well, and look, Tripp, homebrew Christianity in your work is not tangential to that emerging church stuff. It was part of the fabric of it. Like it was it is the continuation of the very thing. I will just echo those sentiments as well. It's you're enough of a participant in all of this that had you and had homebrewed Christianity not been a thing, a lot of the stuff of the emerging church wouldn't have been the thing that it was. Like it was an irreplaceable portion of all of that. And that's true for all of these things, for every little node. If you buy into network theory the way I do, that's how networks operate, right? There's bigger nodes and smaller nodes, and more things go through some places than others, but all of them are part of this whole ecosystem. And homebrew is probably the most public continuation. Tony, I don't know if you know of some other things, but I think it's probably the most public continuation of that same work that it was part of, that's continued on, for the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years.
Yeah, suck it, Nick and Josh.
Who?
The Nick and Josh
exactly.
podcast.
Who?
Yeah, exactly. Not that they care. I just throwing a little taunt out.
If they've listened this long, good for them.
Yeah. But this has been a blast, and look forward to seeing you, Doug, in January. I'm going to be there because I'll be teaching at Luther, and should get
when's that?
The week of the 8th. The week of the 8th.
Okay, I'm in North Carolina on the 11th.
Well, that's good. I'll be
around that. So
I live in North Carolina, so
I know we'll be swapping spots.
I'll be freezing cold, and you'll say, "Oh."
I'll be like, "Hey, we should go for a round of golf."
All right. Well, it'd be weird sleeping in your kid's bed if you're not there.
Yeah, especially because that's not at our house anymore. You'd be at their house. That'd be really weird. But yeah, hey, come stay at our place.
All right.
About every 500 years, the Latinized culture goes through a huge upheaval, and we're going through one right now. Every time that happens, whatever form of Christianity has to drop back and reconfigure. It doesn't ever cease to be.
They had a deep suspicion of hierarchy and institutionalism.
If fear is the motivation behind not dealing with those sort of in the back of your mind questions, that to me is the worst kind of faith of all. It's despair.
For a decade at the beginning of the 21st century, a group of Christian leaders launched a movement meant to change the church in America.
It's more important for us to feel like we are representing a beautiful expression of our life with God.
It's an invitation into a kind of creativity and a set of conversations and questions.
They were young, in their 20s and 30s, and disillusioned with the way that Christianity was being taught and practiced.
On the website, it said, no need to check your culture at the door. So sport your tats, wear your jeans, carry your Java, and join us at liturgy. And I think I read that 10 times.
Christianity was becoming increasingly nonsensical to me when I found out that there was a group of people having the same conversation I was having. I was like, oh, wow, there's more people.
They planted churches and hosted conferences. They wrote worship songs and they published books. They met in cohorts and bars, and they met online in the blogosphere.
Above all else, they called each other friends.
Because to some degree, the path that we were on required courage. Because if you had integrity, it was going to change the game. Is there any hope for the traditional church?
This was the emerging church movement, and for a time, it was considered by some to be the future of Christianity in America.
And now the first of a special two-part series on a growing movement that's rethinking what Christianity and the church should look like in contemporary culture.
I mean, the friggin' New York Times shows up, and PBS and ABC.
Yeah, I remember all of them. And by others, to be the single greatest threat to the faith.
It's over. He's not orthodox. He's just gone so far that it's barely possible to call him a Christian anymore.
So we'll set aside all of our doctrinal differences to save the planet. Let the people go to hell.
Basically, the sentiment of the statement that God's truth evolves. And I see that as a complete undermining of the very nature of what Christianity is and always has been.
And then, almost as quickly as it appeared, it disappeared. Or did it? Maybe instead of going away, it infiltrated all parts of the church in America. I'm Tony Jones.
And I'm Tripp Fuller. And this is Emerged, an oral history of the emerging church movement.
I want to find my way back home.
Over a series of episodes and interactive live streams, we will chart the story of the movement through the voices of its leaders,
including Brian McLaren,
Nadia Boltz-Weber,
Doug Pagitt,
and never-before-heard audio from Rachel Held Evans.
So are we done? It's been real.
We'll assess the movement's successes and its failures, and we will consider its legacy.
We invite you to partner with us as we record interviews, unearth long-buried audio, and build a story that we hope you will find compelling, enjoyable, and maybe bring back some good memories.
Click through the link and join us by contributing. When you do, you'll be invited into a private Facebook group.
You'll get sneak peek mini episodes all fall. You'll be invited to join us for live stream previews, and you'll be able to upload your own emerging church memories to the Emerged archive.
Emerged will launch on January 1, 2024.
Emerged is produced by Josh Gilbert and is a homebrewed Christianity production.
So I can begin